Rajeev Gowda ji. Left only. Shri MB.
What music is correct?
Vice Chairman, sir, I'm happy to be able to talk about the Securities Bill. Sir, I'm also very happy to learn that over the last few years, SEBI has been able to crack down on a number of chit fund and Ponzi scheme scams. Around 20 lakh investors were being cheated out of nearly 20,000 crores. Sir, it was possible for SEBI to investigate these frauds and bring the culprits to book because of the Securities Laws Amendments ordinances that the UPA government had brought in over the last 2 years. It's finally a very great relief to see that after years of these ordinances being extended because of parliamentary disruptions, the Securities Amendment Bill is finally set to become an act. So India has a large number of very talented entrepreneurs. But if we create a regulatory ambience, an infrastructure that has gaps in it, then there are some who are led astray, who are tempted to bilk the poor investor of their hard-earned savings. This often takes place through fraudulent chit funds and Ponzi schemes. Every such scam gives a bad name to legitimate chit funds and spoils the investment landscape for the poorest of the poor. SEBI has long been requesting sweeping powers, sir, and the UPA's ordinances and this bill are the first major steps that will help plug these regulatory gaps and help turn the situation around. So in order to protect the Aam Aadmi and Aurat, the UPA government promulgated these ordinances. Finally, these ordinances are seeing the light of day in the form of an act, and this will really help to change the whole regulatory environment. Already, in response to a parliamentary question in March 2013, we saw that SEBI had been quite effective. 669 companies had been probed for violating these collective investment schemes and collecting about 7,500 crores. These collective investment schemes are often illegal, unregulated, or Ponzi schemes. 552 of such companies were prosecuted, and convictions were secured in 124 cases. Another 75 wound up their business and refunded money to their investors. SEBI has initiated action on many such cases and companies that raised close to 4,000 crores and asked them to wind down their schemes. In this fiscal year itself, 28 firms have faced SEBI's wrath and are now turning around their operations and refunding their resources. So on this note, I would like to congratulate and thank the NDA government for adopting yet another vital and crucial policy initiative of their UPA predecessor. So you may ask, how does this bill strengthen SEBI? So this bill gives SEBI tremendous scope to determine what constitutes a collective investment scheme. It allows potentially fraudulent schemes to be regulated carefully, irrespective of the capital amounts involved, or whether they're started by formal corporate entities or even by individuals. These were gaps in the previous regulatory architecture, sir. This flexibility is vital for SEBI to do its job effectively. Sir, another aspect of this bill is Section 11C, which allows SEBI additional powers, including for search and seizure, for recording statements under oath, etc. SEBI has been empowered to enforce court orders through attaching the violator's property, bank account, through the arrest and detention of the violator. Such kind of powers are absolutely necessary, sir, under certain amount of judicial oversight to ensure that potential violators think twice before indulging in their criminal activities. So the NDA government has also realized the importance of speedy and certain justice. It has retained the provisions in the bill, creating a special court to ensure speedy trials. So at this moment, under the law, under the proposed law, this special court consists of a single judge. So basically, if you think about the challenge, the scope of, and the magnitude of the challenge before us, I think this may be a limitation of this bill, sir. We take pride in our democracy, we take pride in our rule of law, but our reputation suffers because of an overloaded judicial system. Justice delayed is not just justice denied, sir. It is also a signal to crooks and criminals that they can get away with gaming the judicial system. Our finance minister, in his previous avatar as a law minister, had also paid attention to this particular issue and had brought in a number of measures to unclog the judicial system. He would be quite cognizant of what I'm talking about, and therefore I would urge him to ensure that such special courts are not just set up in just Mumbai, but across the country, so that in every region we have the judicial architecture strengthened to ensure that white-collar criminals do not get away with their scams. So, over the years, SEBI has really needed a lot of regulatory support to do its job. This can be seen from a report, a survey conducted by SEBI and NCAR in 2011. It showed, sir, that the investor population in India has actually dwindled from 20 million to 10 million in the last 25 years. This has happened despite automation, despite trade guarantees, tax concessions, and a sharp decline in brokerage charges. Investors have left the markets because they have seen people's investments get decimated because of shady practices without any redress available. Barring occasional blips, the primary market remains lifeless, sir, and mutual funds are not able to attract the retail money that it needs to attract. So, in economics, we teach a concept called revealed preference. To understand how well a regulatory environment functions, we need to see what people actually do. Through their actions, we're able to understand the true impact of our regulatory architecture. In India, when you look at the true impact, you see where people are parking their savings. They are parking their savings in fixed deposits in banks, knowing fully well that inflation will reduce the value of their savings. They are focusing their money on the temptations offered by Ponzi schemes, by other elements like chit funds, which are really should not necessarily be part of a modern financial architecture. So SEBI has a huge role to play in fixing this kind of a problem. It needs to reassure every Indian that equity markets and mutual funds are viable, secure avenues for investment, that their risks are transparent and visible to everyone. SEBI has both the roles of a nurturer of the market and of a policeman. And it is not as if these roles are in conflict. The more effective SEBI is as a policeman, the more trust it engenders in the people of India, and the more resources will flow into the stock markets. If SEBI can end scams, then India has a treasure trove of savings below people's pillows, underneath their beds, wherever they park their savings, and that will start coming back into the market, and it will ensure that Indian companies, Indian entrepreneurs can draw on huge resources that are currently lying untapped or being invested in gold. So, SEBI can do much more on the enforcement front. Already, some of my earlier speakers, my colleagues, have spoken about insider trading and issues of that sort. So let me also draw your attention to the non-performing assets of various public sector banks. Numerous promoters have ended up defrauding these banks and somehow have escaped even prosecution, forget arrest and anything more. SEBI needs to go after these sorts of criminals and ensure that our banking system is also strengthened in association with our equity markets. Similarly, many foreign private equity firms had come into India's market and invested in various private sector companies here, sir. Again, various promoters have run away with those resources, siphoned them off, and the private equity players have had no option but to sell their investments at a deep discount just to ensure that their overall portfolio does not get tainted by this particular experience. We need to go after those kinds of crooks and criminals as well, sir, and only then will we be able to attract one more avenue of investment which is crucial to India's growth. SEBI also has some other challenges, sir. I'd like to point out that public accountability over SEBI needs to be strengthened. There's also concern about investor voices being paid attention to by this organization. And finally, this whole concern about overlapping jurisdictions and what impact that would have on the actual regulatory outcome. So on accountability, I'd like to point out that we must institute a mechanism by which SEBI tells some aspect, some pillar of the government about how well it is doing in terms of its enforcement mandate every year. Asking the government to pay attention to this would be essentially executive interference in an independent regulator, sir. But nothing comes in the way of Parliament asking SEBI for an annual report on how well it is doing the job that we have entrusted it with. I would urge you, sir, through you, I would urge the Finance Minister to work out an arrangement whereby SEBI provides us this kind of an accountability every year. Today, not just SEBI, but any time Parliament interacts with regulators, it is in the context of some crisis, some scam. Those settings are not conducive for constructive engagement. We end up in a confrontational setting. At least one of the parties is on the defensive. We need to change that in the interest of strengthening our financial regulatory architecture, sir. So, India's regulatory mechanisms, whether RBI, SEBI, the Insurance Regulatory Development Authority, the Forward Markets Commission, all of them have not been part of a concrete design. They have evolved over the years through various decisions taken in different contexts. Through these gaps, we find Ponzi schemes emerging. We find various regulatory overlaps, various regulatory challenges, and these will allow various entrepreneurial not in the healthy sense, but in the sense of looking for holes in the system, for those sorts of firms to innovatively shop between various regulatory forums to come up with mechanisms that evade regulation. We cannot allow that to happen, sir, and we must strengthen the regulatory and enforcement architecture to ensure that no such gaps remain. So I do have another concern with one aspect of this bill. This has to do with the disgorgement of funds that have been collected from scamsters. So right now, the Finance Minister proposes to park this money in SEBI's Investor Protection and Education Fund. So this money belongs to the investors who have lost their precious life savings. How can you take it and put it aside in another fund? Why doesn't the Finance Minister earmark one of his trademark 100 crores for the education purpose and ensure that this money goes back, this hard-earned savings of the poorest of the poor goes back to those who've invested in cheat funds and Ponzi schemes, sir? Finally, sir, SEBI has looked at its mandate in a somewhat limited manner. Just like the Reserve Bank of India has adopted a mandate of financial inclusion, which has ensured that banking services reach the poorest of the poor in every village. Similarly, sir, I would think, and I would urge through you, the Finance Minister, to ensure that SEBI also ends up with financial inclusion as part of its mandate. There is no reason why equity markets and mutual funds should be the preserve of urban, well-heeled individuals. These sorts of markets, these sorts of investment avenues must be accessible to the poorest of the poor, must be accessible to everyone in every village, sir. I believe SEBI can make financial inclusion part of its mandate and give a new meaning to the word equity. It's not just about stocks, sir. It is also about justice and inclusion. Only when SEBI actively pays attention to financial inclusion will we ensure that these modern elements of financial architecture, the mutual funds, the stock market schemes, every one of them will be accessible to every individual. They will not need to be tempted by prospects from various kinds of fly-by-night operators. So, with these suggestions and taking all these other issues into consideration, I commend this bill as a key step to improving India's financial architecture. It's still a small step in a long journey, and there is much more to do in the days ahead. Thank you.